Nirasya sarva sandeham akikritya sudarshanam prakashita rahasyam tam bhajami gurumishwaram itam Shri Radhika prana natha pada sarojayo yena premanubhutyasha dattam tam Shri Gurum bhaje Shri Govinda Pararavinda Marupananya Vilashujitan Purna Prema Rasutsavo Jalamano Vritti Prasannananan Shashvad Krishna Katha Mahamrita Payora Shomura Kedato Bande Bhagavatani Mananudavam Murdna Nipatyakshito Namah Shri Guru Krishnaya Nirupadi Kripa Krite Yashri Chaitanya Rupo Bhutanvan Prema Rasam Kado Jayatam Surato Pangor Mama Mandamater Gati Matsarvasva Parambojo Radha Madana Mohana Adadanastrinam Dantoyer Yacheham Puna Puna Srimad Rupa Parambojo Dhulisyam Janma Janmani Abhirapali Patiputra Kanta Dasya Bilashati Balashvavara Sri Rupa Chintamala Sapti Sangsto Matsvanta Durdanta Haichurastam Raganugami bhajano lasamanasanam Shiradhaya sahasada smaratam brajendhum Shri Rupa parakamala shita chetasam me Chittam satam nirupari madhukari yatupada padme Bhaktirya Nikilarta Varga Jananiya Brahma Sakshat Kriter Anandatishaya Prada Vishaya Jat Sukyat Vimuktir Yaya Shri Radha Ramanam Padam Bhaja Yugam Yasya Mahanashrayo Karya Vrajalokavat Gurutara Premnaiva Tasyai Namah Yaramya Nikilagha Sangashamani Shutratritim Sangata Yasvadya Rasikai Sukabdi Janani Dhikarya Mukti Spriham Yadhyata Hridaye Vrajendra Tanuja Premamrita Syandini Saji Yadhari Bhakta Vrinda Mohita Dhanye Padyavali. By the grace of Shri Kali Yuga Pavana, the Swabhajana Vibhajana, Prayojana Avatar, Prema Purushottam, Karuna Mahasagar, Shri Gauranga Mahaprabhu, and his beloved Parshad, the crest jewel of Gaudiya Vaishnavacharyas, Sri Rupa Gosvami Prabhupada. Again, today we'll continue our discussion of Padyavali. And today, we're here in the section on Bhagavad-dharma-tattva, and in particular, we're in the third section of the verse on this subject matter, which speaks to the subject of jāti buddhi in regard to Vaiṣṇavas, or how Vaiṣṇavas are to be respected irrespective of their caste. In other words, just because a Vaishnava was born into any particular caste doesn't mean that we should neglect to honor their Vaishnavata, or that considerations of caste should overshadow the respectability of their Vaishnavata. So, does that mean that the caste into which of a Vaishnava born should be completely ignored at the same time? Well, no, as we're going about and as we're going about demonstrating. So in the last discussion, we went about explaining how caste is ascertained, how birth is a deciding factor in that, according to the Bhagavatam and according to the Acharyas that are the primary authorities in our sampradaya in regard to interpretation of the Bhagavatam. But that birth is by no means the only consideration, and rather it's the least significant of considerations. So it's neither a consideration that can be removed or ignored, nor something that should be overstated or that should overshadow the other considerations, meaning that recognition of the necessary samskaras, recognition of the appropriate qualities, of the appropriate conduct, and so forth. These things are also essential, and wherever qualities, conduct, etc. are found, due respect is to be shown to that. So we covered these topics in the last discussion, so now we'll look further at this topic of why the Bhagavatam teaches this idea that a caste is worthy of respect, or in particular that certain castes are worthy of special respect. This is something that can go against egalitarian Western thinking. So today we'll look at why these points are made in the Bhagavatam, what reasoning is given for them, how Bhagavan himself has taught this idea in various places throughout the Bhagavatam. And again, as I mentioned last time, we're approaching this through the lens of the commentaries of Sridhar Samipad, Sanatana Gosvami Pad, Jiva Gosvami Pad, Vishwanath Chakravarti Pad. We're looking at this subject as they've discussed it, which obviously is specific to the social context and the texts that they were writing about. So how this exactly we want to consider it applicable in the modern day is not something I'm specifically attempting to speak to at this time, but to clarify what is the fundamental statements about these subjects in the primary literature of our sampradaya, to inform a discussion about that. And also to inform us in terms of how to relate to the mentality of those who lived in that society where these ideas were predominant and where caste norms were established. So in other words, what was the predominant thinking about this subject matter in the minds of Mahaprabhu's companions during what we love to call Gora Lila? What was that mentality? And moreover, in Krishna Lila, what was the attitude towards caste that's embedded in that context? And as for those who meditate upon these Leelas, who seek to understand the abhiman, or the sense of identity that is fostered by the participants in this Leela, these subject matters are also useful to understand in that respect. So, having made these points, let me resume from where we were last time. Just, sorry, one sec. Where did that go? Gosh, one moment, please. Okay. Then, so I resume. In this regard, one may still wonder why the Brahmana caste is regarded as superior to all other castes or jātis and worthy of special respect. The reasons for this can be found in numerous teachings of Sri Bhagavan himself throughout Srimad Bhagavatam. Bhagavan Sri Krishna explains in the Bhagavad 11:17, 13, and 14 that the Shudras, Vaishyas, Kshatriyas, and Brahmanas emanate from the feet, thighs, arms, and face of the Purush, and that the Grihastas, Brahmacharis, Vanaprastas, and Sannyasis emanate from the loins, heart, chest, and head of the Purush. Similar descriptions of the places of origin of the Varnas can be found elsewhere in Srimad Bhagavatam, as well as in the Rig Veda, Yajur Veda, and Atharva Veda. Bhagavan Sri Krishna then explains in 11.17.15 the significance of these respective places of origin. So the lower, low, higher, and higher characteristics of the Varnas and Ashramas of human beings have come about according to their place of birth from the body of the Purush. The implication of this statement is that the Varnas and Ashramas are to be considered ranked from lower to higher in the order they were aforementioned, in accord with the relative height of their place on the origin of the body of the Purush. Because the Brahmana Varna is said to originate from the face of the Purush, it is understood that the Brahmana Varna is considered worthy of the highest respect among all the Varnas. Sri Samipad also explains in this regard that unlike the other Varnas, which emanate from the Purush by means of Rajas, Tamas, and a mixture thereof, the Brahmana Varna emanates purely by means of Sattva Gun. The import of this, as well as of the Brahmana Varna's origin from the face of the Purusha, is that Brahmanas are meant to be instrumental in the preservation of sattva and dharma in human society by means of their sattvic conduct, provisioning of education in the Veda, performance of sacrifice, and bhakti to Sri Bhagavan. As sattva gun, dharma, and bhakti are the all-important basis of all living beings attaining well-being in this world and the next, so those who sustain all these all-important assets to all living beings are due the highest respect. So, essentially, what we have is a functional justification. Why is this caste or this jāti said to be worthy of the greatest respect? Because the contribution to society that it provides is considered most valuable, or considered most essential to the ultimate well-being of all the members of society. So, as a state of sattvic, the mind in a state of sattva is the greatest, or within the worldly context, the greatest or most fulfilling state. So those that bring about or facilitate the mind having the means by which to exist in a state of sattva are considered essential to that bringing about the satisfaction of society, of people in general. So they're, because of the great contribution they make, then they're afforded proportionate special respect. This would be the basic logic. Out of regard for this all-important function in society performed by the Brahmanas, Sri Bhagavan himself is well known to accordingly exhibit the virtue known as Brahmanyata, that is, quote, being a bhakta of Brahmanas, meaning being a supporter, benefactor, and worshipper of Brahmanas. So I haven't bothered to elaborate, but there's many places where the word Brahmanyata or Brahmanya is glossed by our acharyas. I've given those in the footnote, so you can see all of that. But essentially, what is appreciable here is, while some people with a modern attitude may be averse to this idea of showing special respect to Brahmanas or showing special patronage to Brahmanas, none other than Bhagavan himself is very fond of doing so and is praised in the Shastra for this very quality. In Chaitanya Charitamrita, when Sriman Mahaprabhu's offering obeisances to Sri Jagannath during the Ratha Yatra is described, Sriman Mahaprabhu is said to recite a verse of Prahlad Maharaj, wherein Sri Bhagavan's quality of Brahmanyata is praised. So this is a well-known verse which says, Namo Brahmanya Devaya, Go Brahmana Hitaya Cha, Jagaditaya Krishnaya, Govindaya, Namo Namah. So the very first point is obeisance unto the Deva of Brahmanyas. So Sridhar Samipad, in his commentary on the Vishnu Puran, where this verse comes from, takes Deva here to mean one who is the best, or who is the Shrestha. So Brahmanya Devaya means among those who are Brahmanya, or among those who favor Brahmanas or support Brahmanas, Bhagavan is the greatest or the best of them. Means he's a champion of supporting Brahmanas. Moreover, he is, quote, the benefactor of the cows and Brahmanas, unto the benefactor of the world, Krishna, Govinda, obeisance and obeisance. So here we have Mahaprabhu himself joyfully reciting this statement of praise of Sri Krishna before Jagannath Dev, and electing to choose this particular verse where Bhagavan's quality of being Brahmanya Deva, or the greatest of supporters of Brahmanas, is mentioned. So, if this is not, you could say, central to the Gaudiya tradition, if the way Mahaprabhu himself prays to Jagannath is not indicative of something that's considered important to understand, or a particular attitude that's important to Bhagavan, then, what is? Now, of course, we won't say that this is deeply essential to the spirit of Braja Prem and all of that, but nevertheless, that it's integral to the overall worldview in which such Leela, in which such Prem exists, is important to understand. So, Bhagavan Vishnu himself also professes the great extent of his Brahmanyata, and the great extent to which he is pleased by virtue of Brahmanyata in others, in a statement he makes to the 4 Kumaras, who are Brahmana sons of Brahmadev in Srimad Bhagavatam. So in case any strict Jiva Gosvami followers are going, okay, fine, the Vishnu Puran says that, but we want evidence from Bhagavatam, then here you go, we're coming with repeated, elongated passages from the Bhagavatam on this topic. And, as we broadly understand, the essential characteristic or the intrinsic characteristic of Uttama Bhakti is anukulyena Krishnanushīlanam, or activities which are pleasing to Krishna. So here, from these statements, we can understand that engaging in giving respect to Brahmanas is such an act. In other words, honoring Brahmanas is an expression of Vaishnavata. Honoring Brahmanas is an expression of bhakti because it's a means by which Bhagavan is pleased. So these are statements that illustrate this. And this is a bit of a long passage. Just to save time, I'll just read the translation. So, and it's quite a long, extended sentence, so it's a little bit of a challenge to read through. Pardon me for my stubborn style of always matching the grammatical structure of the original verses and not breaking the sentences into shorter bits. Please bear with me in this respect. He, upon plunging into the nectar of hearing about whose untainted glory, the whole world is immediately purified, including even dog cookers, meaning outcasts, that is, Vikunta Bhagavan, who having attained the fame of being an excellent tīrtha, that is, source of purification, because of you all, that is, because of all of you Brahmanas, again, this is Bhagavan speaking to the Kumaras, by the worship of whom I am endowed with purifying dust on my lotus feet, purged of all contamination instantly, possessed of good character, and such that Shri, meaning Lakshmi, for the sake of attaining an instant of whose attention others, namely the devas led by Brahma, observe restraints, austerities, and so on, does not abandon me, although I am detached. I who am such shall cut off even my own arm if it is unfavorably engaged towards you Brahmanas. So this is quite a strong remark, right? To say that, before I would do anything detrimental to you, I would first cut off my own arm. And on top of that, to say that I purify others because I have the touch of the dust of your feet, that I'm purified of ills by your touch. So Bhagavan here is praising Brāhmaṇas as being the source of his own purity and his capacity to purify others. And with that, saying that he would, it would be unthinkable for him to do anything detrimental to Brāhmaṇas. I do not eat an oblation from a performer of yajna in a sacrifice through the mouth of the fire in the sacrifice, as I eat, should that be a morsel, covered with dripping ghee through the mouth of an eating Brahmana, who is satisfied with the results of his own actions offered to me. So I'm more pleased not by the offering in the yajna directly to me, but by Brahmanas being fed well. This pleases me even more. Quote, I am more satisfied with offerings made to Brahmanas than I am with offerings made to me directly in the fire of a yajna. So now someone might say, okay, but what about when these Brahmins are sometimes rude? Or what about when their behavior is not perfect? You're so pleased by us respecting these Brahmanas, okay, we'll respect them. But sometimes they're misbehaved, or sometimes they're harsh. So what about situations like that? Presupposing this, Bhagavan says, who would not forgive even misbehaved Brahmanas, whose taintless foot dust I carry on my own crown? I who am possessed of the undivided and unchecked magnificence of my Yogamaya potency, and whose worship water, that is, the water used to worship whose feet, immediately purifies all planes along with Shiva. That is, everyone should forgive Brahmanas if they commit some transgression, since even I do so and carry the foot dust of Brahmanas atop my head. So what this implies is that a Brahmana is worthy of respect irrespective of their behavior. The same point we hear made by Jiva Gosvami very strongly in regard to Vaiṣṇavas. There's a statement which will come also in this, I believe in this commentary or perhaps elsewhere, but we've covered at some point, where he says, how does it go? Vaiṣṇava pujaka? I forget the whole statement, but he says, those who are Vaishnav pujakas, or those who worship Vaishnavas, or who wish to show respect to Vaishnavas, never judge their character. Means the respectability of a Vaishnava and the behavior of a Vaishnava, these are two separate things. Now, you might say, well, we just heard earlier that respect is shown in response to the conduct of someone. Agreed. That special respect can be added, if you will, to the extent of the exaltedness of a person's conduct. No harm. But that misconduct can cancel out respectability, this doesn't follow. In other words, a Vaishnava does not even assess or consider it essential to judge the behavior of a Vaishnava. One who wants to worship Vaishnavas worships Vaishnavas. He doesn't judge their character. They're just worshipable. How they behave, that's just another thing. Now, if they behave well and that's observed, then if some additional special honor or adoration is shown in response to that, no harm. But if in the course of going to observe and seek some speciality, one judges and finds fault and then neglects to show the due respect, then that turns into an aparad on the part of the attempted worshipper. So similarly here, he's saying, even if a Brahmana is misbehaved, he's saying, I still hold their foot dust on my head. I still show respect to them, regardless of how they behave. So this is something that's very valuable in practical life. It even has, it could be, a way that the Sanatana Dharma culture, the Vaiṣṇava culture, can also have a broader political or social benefit to this idea that there's an inherent respectability in human beings, especially in cultured human beings or Brahmanas or Vaishnavas, which is always to be sustained whatever their ideology is, whatever their activity is. that those things also matter, those things are also to be observed, but that we shouldn't completely pin or hinge respectability on, to put it simply, achar or vichar. Whatever the person's achar, bichar, or babahar may be, they're still respectable. Maybe not as much, just as the passages we read last time. They're further respectable if they have excellent achar, bichar, and so on, but they never lose their respect. They're a fundamental degree of respectability, even if they don't score high points on the achar or bichar rubric. This is the point being made here, so that point applies to Vaiṣṇavas, and as per the statement here of Bhagavan Vishnu, it applies to Brāhmaṇas as well. So, moving on, the principal administrator of justice, meaning Yamaraj's vultures. So now he's coming with the vyati rake, or, and if you don't get it, then what happens? Meaning the emissaries of Yamaraj in the form of vultures, wrathful like snakes, angrily tear apart they of vision impaired by sin, who see the best of the twice-born, cows, and living beings devoid of shelter, who are forms of me, that is, who are dwelling places of mine, and who are my own, with thought of distinction from me. That is, without recognizing that the twice-born, meaning Brahmanas, are objects of my sense of I, cows are object of my sense of my, and the shelterless are objects of my compassion. I'm filling this in from the commentaries. You can see all that in the footnotes. This point is made by Jiva Gosvami. So what he's saying is that, and as something we discussed earlier at length, that the pervading presence of Bhagavan within everything makes everything worthy of respect. This is, in a nutshell, in the 11th canto, what's called Sarvabhuteshu Manmati, or the awareness of my presence in all entities. That every entity is to be shown respect because it's a adishtan, because it's a dwelling place of Bhagavan. And then additional respect is to be shown to the depth of of consciousness of Bhagavan. So Brahmanas are considered most respectable in comparison to other human beings. Vaiṣṇavas are considered even more respectable. Uttam Vaiṣṇavas, Mahabhagavatas are considered even more respectful. This is all things we discussed in regard to the Turnadu Pisunichana, this slok. So, similarly here, Vishnu is saying that cows are a special adishtan of mine, and, quote, living beings devoid of shelter, that is, the poor or those in need, those should also be seen as a special place of my presence. So this is essential to balance in human society. If we, become callous to the disenfranchisement of others, then this perpetuates suffering as well as egotism within society. So to see those who are in need as places of Bhagavan, in other words, places where special regard is to be shown, as well as cows, those who provide all the essential ingredients for the performance of yajna, those who are, considered dear to Bhagavan for so many other reasons, as well as the twice-born, in other words, as well as those who are highly cultured and preserving, the culture whereby all of these things are understood and whereby these finer potential for human experience can be accomplished. If we don't show due respect to these persons by neglecting to see the honorable presence of Bhagavan within them, then here, using some, fear-inducing language, then, quote, one will be angrily torn apart by vultures sent by Yamaraj. So, this is being said in a very blunt and a very strong way. So now he adds, the carrot in addition to the stick, if you will, by saying, I am captivated by they of satisfied heart, and lotus faces moistened with the nectar of gentle smiles, who assuage even insulting Brahmanas, just as I do, in the case of Bhrigu and others, worshipping them with mind upon me, that is, with the vision of me within them, and praising them with speech replete with the art of affection, like a son who similarly pacifies his angry father. So someone who can convert negativity into positivity, who can, adjust and, create a positive outcome out of a negative, this is essentially what Dharma is. So even if someone is insulting, even if someone is, behaving in a non-ideal manner, if someone can transmute that into an expression of respect, an expression of tolerance, an expression that builds a, brings a wave of positive energy into the flow of, human exchange, having converted it from a negative energy, then he's saying that I am captivated by that person. In other words, that person gets my grace. That person succeeds in satisfying me. And he adds, again, that the worship shown to Brāhmaṇas, or worship shown to cows, or worship shown to the needy, or worship shown to everyone, the all-pervading principle is that ultimately it's all worship of Bhagavan. It's all relative recognition of the presence of Bhagavan. This is Jiva Goswami's universal theory of sammukhyata, and how every feature of, conventional dharma, as well as its, flourishing, if you will, in the form of Vaiṣṇava dharma, is all built to nurture and to deepen this quality of sammukhyata, from a general awareness ultimately to prema bhakti. So essential to that is to seek to show honor, and to do so even if the other person is not behaving in a way that evokes honor. This is the test to prove that you have the quality of respectfulness and not simply are engaging in a transactional exchange for the benefit that comes to you out of showing respect to the other, or, driven by a worldly sense of ego in which you don't like to be treated harshly because you think you ought not to be, and therefore you then justify treating the other person in a less than ideal manner just because of their less than ideal behavior. So that someone really has a higher sense of identification and a higher sense of purpose, and thus can transmute these negativities into positivities. This is essentially what pleases Bhagavan. So the idea that, pleasing Bhagavan is indifferent to, or has nothing to do with, something that will stimulate mutually beneficial, harmonizing relations in the world, practically speaking, between human beings, this is an unfortunate abstraction. Or rather, if we carefully read where the Bhagavatam addresses this many, many times, that understanding of all of these abstract spiritual principles ultimately is meant to translate into extremely practical, kind, respectful, and warm behavior. So this is, a point of corroboration that we can also use for introspection and assessment in our practice and social dealings. Anyway, without elaborating too much, this is the first passage given here, Bhagavan Vishnu himself speaking about how greatly he's satisfied by honoring Brāhmaṇas and showing that that respect is to be shown to them unconditionally. In other words, even if they treat you badly, even if their conduct is not good, still respect is to be shown to them. In commenting on these verses, Sri Samipad states that Bhagavan Vishnu's intent is to say that, quote, the Brahmana is my greatest mouth, meaning the primary means by which he is pleased to receive dharmic offerings. Sri Jivapad comments that Bhagavan Vishnu's intent is to convey that, quote, my inner satisfaction shall come about specifically by means of a Brahmana's satisfaction. In other words, if you please a Brahmana, I'm pleased with that. If you please a Vaiṣṇava, I'm pleased with that. Sri Chakravartipad further portrays Bhagavan Vishnu's intent as follows. Quote, I worship the Brahmanas specifically, and only they who shall become engaged in worship of Brahmanas are accepted by me as worshippers of myself, since I eat specifically through the mouth of Brāhmaṇas. Even a transgression committed by a Brāhmana is verily to be tolerated, and not rather to be counteracted. What to speak of those who are intolerant of a transgression committed by Brāhmanas? Even seers of a break from thought of me in Brāhmanas, that is, even persons who fail to see that I am present in Brāhmanas, are verily situated in Naraka. So this is, again, strong language, which shows that respect for Brāhmanas is an integral quality of a Vaiṣṇava. That if a Vaiṣṇava is to completely ignore, the role of Brāhmanas in society or the twice born in society, this goes against Vaiṣṇava principle. That it's pleasing to Bhagavan, it's directly enjoined by Bhagavan in very strong language, that he supports, and desires the role that the Brāhmanas perform for society, and wants that his bhaktas respect that. So this is just one statement of Bhagavan in the Bhagavatam. We're coming with a few more. So we're going to go thoroughly into this subject matter, just because it's something that is, in today's society where the Varnashram system is essentially defunct as far as it not being an actually established social order in India or anywhere else, in terms of it, actually guiding the actual political governance of a community. Can be a sense of abstraction from how this was practically conducted in society. And as I said, modern, egalitarian attitudes and other things can also, it can be hard to adjust to some of this perspective. So that's why I'm giving a little bit of extra detail here. Prithu Maharaj, a Palan Shaktyavesh avatar, that is, a jiva who is empowered with Sri Bhagavan's potency for the sake of preservation of the world, and thus revered as an avatar of Sri Bhagavan, also speaks at length in praise of the extent to which Bhagavan honors Brāhmanas, in an address he delivers to an assembly of devas, Brāhmanas, and kings. So again, just to be brief, I'll read the translation. By respectfully bowing to whose feet the deva, that is, the best of Brahmanyas, of those who support the Brāhmanas, the primeval Purush, the foremost of the greatest of the Mahats, Hari himself, attains imperishable Lakshmi and glory, purifying of the entire world, and by worshipping whom, he who dwells in the hearts of all, he who is self-manifest, he to whom the Brāhmanas are dear, or, quote, he who is dear to the Brāhmanas, Ishvara, again, namely Hari himself, is satisfied as desired. That Brahmana caste specifically is to be worshipped in all respects by cultured persons devoted to Hari's Dharma, that is, the preservation of social cohesion. So Bhagavan wants that, for the sake of social cohesion, respect be shown to Brahmanas such that they can perform their contribution to society. So he describes himself, or he describes Bhagavan himself, as someone who is it Vipra? Yes, Vipra Priya, a name of Bhagavan, Vipra Priya, he to whom Brahmanas are dear, or he whom Brahmanas regard as dear. So, if we wish to please Bhagavan, and Bhagavan holds them dear and wants them to be respected, and himself sets an example of respecting them, can we expect to please Bhagavan by disrespecting them? No, this is the point. But another critical feature here, which is something that we're going to develop after we establish these points about the respectability of Brahmanas, is that this is pertaining to what's called lokasangraha, or, quote, social cohesion, or the functioning of the karma marg system as a general social order. So when it says that, what does it say in the verse? that this is a way of accomplishing, quote, Bhagavad-dharma or Hari's dharma. In that context, Bhagavad-dharma is not the same as the way we typically, and as we're speaking about it here in the Padyavali, as being synonymous with the term bhakti marg, or as being synonymous with, in the line of Rupa Goswami, what we call uttama bhakti. In this context, quote, Hari's dharma or Bhagavad-dharma is meaning support for the dharma that Hari has established for the order of human society. So that point will be further clarified later on, but I just added it from the commentary here at this point. So, through whose mouth, and indeed not so through a fire devoid of consciousness, the infinite one, Hari, he whose words are graspable only by paramahamsas, eats an oblation offered with reverence and obeisances unto the object of worship, that is the devas, by persons cognizant of the reality, and by means of worship in regular connection with whom a person of their own, that is without engaging in cultivation of gyan, without any great delay can, by virtue of thereby acquiring a purified mind, attain absolute equanimity, moksha. What greater mouth of the devas exists in this world than that? That is the mouth of a Brahmana. So in other words, he's simply saying that, through the mouth of through the mouth of Brahmanas, Bhagavan accepts, or Bhagavan eats and becomes pleased. So if someone worships those persons, in other words, feeds them and honors them, then one can attain moksha even by that. O honorable people, all my life may I carry atop my crown the dust of the lotus feet of they who by means of faith, austerity, well-being, right conduct, meaning silence, restraint, and samadhi, steadiness of mind, perpetually carry the pure eternal Veda, in which this world appears as though in a mirror, for the sake of sight or understanding of its object. Those Brahmanas' foot dust which quickly destroys the sin of one who always carries it atop the head. All qualities take shelter in him, that is, in one who honors the foot dust of Brahmanas. So Prithu Maharaj is speaking in this assembly, and he goes on to speak also in praise of Vaiṣṇavas, but our topic right now is how he first of all praises Brahmanas. So he's saying that I hold atop my head the foot dust of Brahmanas. Sri Chakravartipad comments in this regard that Sri Prithu Maharaj makes these comments only for the purpose of social cohesion, lokasangraha, the import being that Brahmana bhakti, that is honoring Brahmanas, is an important means of preserving social cohesion in the Varnashram society. Be that as it may, Sri Samipad and Sri Chakravartipad also recognize that Brahmana bhakti is conducive to firmness in bhakti to Sri Bhagavan. The import in this case being that it is also incumbent upon and beneficial for Vaiṣṇavas to show due respect to Brahmanas, because doing so is pleasing to Sri Bhagavan. So I think that's clear. Now, one further statement from yet another avatar. Another Shaktavesh avatar of Sri Bhagavan, Sri Rishabdev, also professes in Srimad Bhagavatam the superiority of Brahmanas among all living beings throughout the world, by virtue of their sattvic conduct and preservation of Vedic culture. Quote, among all entities in this world, those endowed with consciousness, among those which are mobile, are greatly superior to vegetation, that is, immobile entities. Human beings are greatly superior to them. The Pramatas are greatly superior even to them. The Gandharvas are greatly superior to them. The Siddhas are greatly superior to them. The followers of the Devas, that is, the Kinnaras and others, are greatly superior to them. The Asuras are greatly superior to them. The Devas led by Indra are greatly superior to them. The sons of Brahma led by Daksha, the Prajapatis, are greatly superior to them. And among them, Shiva is supreme. He is then the scion of Brahma, meaning Brahma is superior to Shiva. In this analysis, he is he whose superior is me. That is, I am superior to Brahma. And I am he whose devas are the devas among the twice-born. In other words, my objects of worship are the Brāhmaṇas. So this whole gradation of human beings up to devas and ultimately to Bhagavan Vishnu, and then Vishnu saying, but even greater than I are the Brāhmaṇas. O Brāhmaṇas, I do not equate any other entity in this world with Brāhmaṇas. So I do not see anyone. So do I see anyone superior to them? Certainly not. And why not? I eat at will excellent oblations offered with Shraddha by human beings unto Brāhmaṇas, and not so do I eat oblations offered in a fire of sacrifice. By them, namely the Brāhmaṇas, my dear primeval figure, the Veda, is carried in this world, and in them supremely pure sattva, equanimity, sense control, truthfulness, compassion, austerity, forbearance, and realization dwell. So because of this great contribution that Brāhmaṇas make to society, Bhagavan shows such great adoration and support for them, is, in a nutshell, the point being made. Sri Narada, who is regarded as a Bhakti Shakti-vesh avatar of Sri Bhagavan, that is a jiva empowered by Sri Bhagavan to teach and preserve bhakti in the world, also speaks of the superlative respectability of Brāhmaṇas in his teachings to Maharaj Yudhishthir. Quote, even among all embodied beings, O Emperor, know the Brahmana, who by way of austerity, knowledge, and satisfaction carries the Veda, a form of Hari himself, to be a most worthy recipient of respect. Indeed, O King, Brahmanas, who are purifying of the three worlds with their foot dust, are a great object of worship even for him, Krishna, the self of the world. In this statement of Sri Narada, it is to be observed that there is no reference specifically to a Brahmana's being worthy of respect just by birth. Thus, it is noteworthy that Sri Samipad, Sri Jivapad, and Sri Chakravartipad mention in their commentaries on this statement of Sri Narada that the special respectability of Brahmanas by virtue of their birth, as well as their austerity and so forth, is what is spoken of in this verse. So, as we go through, I'm few places giving extra highlighting to the cases where Samipad, Jivapad, Chakravartipad all repeatedly in many cases indicate that Brahmanas are recognized as Brahmanas by birth, and that birth affords them a certain degree of respectability. So what's noteworthy is they don't only just say that in reference to verses like we quoted in the previous class where it's stated in the Bhagavatam itself, but even when they're commenting on verses that don't say that and only talk about the qualities that are respected in Brahmanas, they also add that the respectability based on birth is also relevant. So, this, in one sense, hermeneutically is very, very influential, or it shows the extent to which they internalized this concept, or that they saw this as fundamental to what the intent of the Bhagavatam was. It is thus patently evident that in the view of these three aforementioned acharyas, birth in a family of Brahmanas is indeed a characteristic to which respect is to be shown. Sri Chakravartipad also clarifies the intended sense of Brahmanas being described as an object of worship for even Bhagavan Sri Krishna. Quote, regarding the statement in the Bhagavad 7.14.42 that Brahmanas are, quote, a great object of worship for Krishna. A Brahmana is honored even by him, namely Krishna, because of Krishna's being a Brahmanya, that is, a supporter and worshipper of Brahmanas. And it is not that because of their being an object of worship of Krishna, that Brahmanas are in actuality worthy of respect even more so than him. Are not in actually worthy of respect even more so, that should be than him. This conclusion specifically is to be stated in this regard because of the first worship specifically of Krishna occurring during the Rajasuya sacrifice, even in the presence of many Brāhmaṇas. So Chakravarti Pad is just putting a little balancing point here. If you took this whole progression literally, then you would say, okay, then we should make Brāhmaṇas our ultimate devata and not Krishna. So he's saying not quite that far. In other words, the fact that Krishna is saying that they're worshipable even to me, this isn't meant to be taken that then they're in an ontological or in an ultimate sense, but rather to show that Krishna is supreme and Krishna as such has this quality of brahmanyata. And that if it were not the case, then when Krishna is present in the company of many Brāhmaṇas at a formal function where who gets what's called the Agra Puja, or the first worship, is a big deal, then it wouldn't have occurred that Krishna would take the first worship in front of many Brāhmaṇas if it weren't this way. So he's just showing by reference to other places in the Bhagavatam how this statement in the Bhagavatam shouldn't be taken to imply that. With all the aforementioned statements of Bhagavan Vishnu and the Shaktavesh avatars Sri Prithu Maharaj, Sri Rishabdev, and Sri Narada in mind, one can, oh gosh, there we go, I think I should just cut that. One should see for oneself the grounds on which Bhagavan Sri Krishna describes the essence of a Brahmana's respectability in his aforestated statement to Shrutadev in Srimad Bhagavatam. So, quote, a Brahmana by birth is the best of all living beings here in this world, and all the more so is superior to others when endowed with austerity, learning, contentment, and worship of me. So, this point really says it all, and all these quotes of these different avatars give us a sense of the application, or it shows how these points are being drawn out. That yes, Brahmanas, all these qualities are all respectable, and that birth is also a factor, and that they're ranked in order of importance. In other words, birth is the least important characteristic, or the least important cause of respectability, but a non-negotiable, non-dispensable quality at the same time. So, I'll just go a little further and then we can conclude for today. Still, to understand in further detail why Bhagavan Sri Krishna says here that a Brahmana is the best of all living beings just by virtue of birth, reference can also be made to the Bhagavad 4.31.10, wherein there is a description of the sequence of 3 births that can occur in the lives of the 3 upper Varnas, namely the Brahmana, Kshatriya, and Vaishya Varnas. The seminal birth, the Savitra birth, and the Yajnik, or sacrificial birth. So, actually I think I'm going to stop here because this goes into a bunch of detail and we get into these different categories of births and then technical analysis of their significance and what creates eligibility for which of them in whom and so on. So I think maybe better we dive into that next time. So where we've come up to today is to understand why the Brahmana is regarded as being possessed of special respectability, what are the causes of that, and how birth, as well as qualities, character, conduct, contribution to society, etc., are all factors at play, how they're ranked in a gradation, how these things are taught by Bhagavan himself, how Bhagavan himself shows the example of showing great regard to Brahmanas, and how Bhagavan is pleased by others also in keeping with his conduct, similarly showing due respect to Brahmanas. So this is also, you can say, integral to Gora Lila, integral to Krishna Lila, how Nanda Maharaj and his family honor Gargamuni, honor various Brahmanas in their local, Braj village setting. All of these things are integral to the cultural fabric, if you will, in which this Leela takes place, as well as the Puranic or the Bhagavatam's design, if you will, for a social order and how it's meant to be balanced. So I'll conclude here, and if anyone has any comments, corrections, questions, or anything else, please feel free to share. Yes, I see Vidyaji. Would you like to say something?
Yes, this is a very interesting topic because it's so many levels, and I understand this is not a social class. It's about its ontological presentation of our view of Shastra on the subject of structure of the society. But I find it quite idealistic in context of our current situation in India. But first of all, this kind of behavior towards Brahmanas can be only practiced in society that accepts Brahmanas as important part of society, which excludes every single country except India, I believe. So in the context of Western egalitarian society, there's no even reference, so we're talking about, first of all, we're talking about subject quite isolated socially, and second of all, I find it also a bit archaic, because even in India, the whole society is quite reformed, and there's a lot of pushes within Indian society towards equalization, or again egalitarianism. This we can see in modern times, and I find that first of all, you have to accept the Vedic society of Brahmanas as an important part of society in order to discuss the behavior towards them, right? So I can see it's happening only like within some orthodox part of regions within India, or in Vaishnava society. But even in Vaishnava society, I find it, I find there are two ways, because in classical parivar, classical Indian society, like in villages, the respect to Brahmanas is there, and it's a part of social coherence. Within Gaudiya Vaishnavism, there's a tendency of respecting Vaishnava over actually Brahmana. And maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I find that stress respect towards Vaishnava casts the respect to Brahmana. They're not on a same pair comparing.
Yes, you were saying about the respect for Vaishnavas and then the respect for Brahmanas. Vidyaji, are you there?
Oh, I'm mute. I was muted.
Okay.
Sorry.
Yeah, I heard that you were saying lastly that that Vaishnavas are respected, and then you were going to say something maybe in contrast to that regarding respect for Brahmanas.
Yes. So as I was saying, strictly speaking, Vaishnava society, Gaudiya Vaishnava society, there's tendency more towards respect towards Vaishnava, regardless of his varna, as opposed to respect towards Brahmana, Vaishnava, who is on its own statue. But maybe I don't have this social exposure too much, but whatever I observe over many years, there's that Vaishnava, position of Vaishnava is prioritized over Brahmana. Although it's, in classical Indian society, there's in Vaishnava society, Brahmana Vaishnava is respected, but it's not to the extent as we can, you were listening just now, like extensive glories, and this doesn't stand as much. So I found those statements quite archaic and not really applicable in a modern society. And I was just wondering how it's so, And, we know the opposition of Bhagavan towards Brahmanas, and we learn so we can adjust our behavior, especially those coming from Western culture. Yet I find it, I find it a little bit conflicting because at the same time the respect towards Vaishnavas is quite prominent. So I'm not sure how to even formulate the question, not to challenge anything.
Okay. Well, I'll just say that, some of these passages that I've quoted today, there are passages that follow them in the Bhagavatam that speak about respect of Vaishnavas as well in the context of the same progressions. And the progression mentioned in the 7th canto was something we talked about in regard to the Trinadapi Sunichena verse, the quality of manada, of being respectful. And there it was explained that more than the Brahmana, respectable is the Vaishnava, or the Vaishnava is regarded as being of an order of respectability greater than that of the Brahmana. That point was made there in the 7th canto. Also in these statements of Prithu Maharaj, he goes on to then also speak about the respectability of the Vaishnava after the Brahmana, meaning even in greater degree than the Brahmana. And that's also something that we'll definitely get into in this commentary. And we'll look at a place in the Brihad Bhagavatamrita where Sanatana Gosvami deals with this subject and many other things. So, this is something that we'll look at from a Shastric perspective in much further detail. But in gist, the idea is that, yes, a Vaishnava is regarded as having a higher order of respectability than a Brahmana or a twice-born or anyone else. So there we have a gradation in which there are simultaneously existent criteria for respectability, and that it's not that they eliminate each other, and that we have that if respect is like, some limited commodity, I only have $5, I can only give it to one person. It's like, respect is something that can flow. In other words, you can respect one person and you can respect another person. It's the only thing that it really depletes is maybe your own pride. Not you personally, someone like myself, but respect is something that can, be given quite generously if we're so inclined. So, generally speaking, we can see it in a happy way that, the mood of a Vaishnava, to be tolerant like a tree, humble like a blade of grass, and respectful to everybody, and that they take pleasure in giving respect to others. And if there's some cause of respectability, the presence of Bhagavan in something, we respect that. And when there's special extra qualities of respectability, we get to show more respect because now we have a good reason to do so. And when there's a Vaishnava, then, even more reason to show respect. And, we can see it in a relishable and a joyful manner, as opposed to some, imposed duty that we're forced to robotically perform, some, code of etiquette that's imposed on us that suppresses us and, all this type of stuff. Depending on our own attitude, depending on how much we can integrate this into the spirit of samukhyata, into the spirit of bhakti, then this can be an expression of the heart. This can be a flourishing of the spirit of Vaishnavism. So that's a broad attitude. And as far as practical application in today's society, that's definitely complicated. I can't dive into all of that at this time, but in a simple way, I would just say that in the course of our life, we do, at least living in India, you do meet people who are, in some cases, Brahmanas who've come in a family of many generations of Brahmanas. In our Sampradaya, there are, descendants of Nityananda Prabhu, descendants of Advaita Prabhu, descendants of other Parikaras or the disciples of Parikaras of Mahaprabhu that continue lineages today. And so in the context of living within our Vaishnav community, we do meet people who come from these lineages, and some more others will continue some of those Brahminical aspects of their Varna or of their family tradition. So my personal 2 cents is that there's no harm, and I find it, pleasurable and interesting to show respect to the continuation of those traditions and to those aspects of the culture and of the heritage that they embody and that they carry forward. And that, that's not unpleasant, or that's not something, I don't see that as bad, so to speak. There may have been historically instances in which, those in the Brahmana caste or those in these, Vangshas that were kind of gurus by birth may not have satisfied everyone with their behavior, and there may have been exploitation of that and so on in the past. Well, so what? In other words, it's not like people who aren't born in, like, no guru who's not born a Brahmin also hasn't sometimes abused the post. Like, that's everywhere, So to me, to cast out this category or neglect to show this element of the tradition and these elements of these principles just because historically it may have been, not in a healthy state or not practiced in an ideal manner, I don't feel that it's fair to, so to speak, throw the baby out with the bathwater or just say, oh, this became defunct at such and such point in history, and therefore we're just going to scrap it for all time forever, and there's nothing else to this, and we'll just suppress any concept of there being any value in that. I don't feel that that's in keeping with the texts and the broader historical tradition on a longer timeline, and that we should, constantly recalibrate our attitudes and how we act according to the actual practical situation that we live in our times, not just read the way that things are in our times through the filter of attitudes that were prominent in the social context of culture 100 years ago or 150 years ago or 50 years ago or what have you. So I'll just say that and today, the way that the Vaishnava society is today, where the kind of hegemony of these descendants having what was sort of perceived as a monopoly on giving diksha within the sampradaya and things like that, that has faded very significantly over the last 100 years. And yet, my experience with many of the people who are descendants of Mahaprabhu's parikaras, who are these quote-unquote jāti Goswamis, I find many of them to be very admirable, very appreciable people. That they're highly educated, they're highly cultured, they're deeply committed to the tradition, they're making a great contribution to society. To have this kind of prejudice, almost, it seems like among some circles there's even an inbuilt, the opposite of respect for these people. There's an inbuilt prejudice against them because of their birth. And that I don't see as healthy or as founded, There may have been, things that happened in the past. There's things that happened on all sides, That shouldn't cloud our understanding of the principles, and that shouldn't also preclude us from appreciating the culture, the education, the social contribution that people are making to today's society according to the means and the ability that they have.
Well, that's a simple Vaishnava conduct would demand of Vaishnava to not to cast any judgment about any type of misbehavior of any class, right? But I have another question. You mentioned achar, vichar, and vyahar. Are they not the same?
Maybe not entirely. I mean, when I use those phrases, I was speaking of vichar in terms of someone's ideas or their, philosophical conclusions or their opinions about certain ideas, and achar as the conduct that they uphold or the general standards that they, adopt. And then you could say in one sense, vyavahar and achar are synonymous, or if you take them as non-synonymous, you could say the code of conduct that someone accepts and then the literal behavior that you experience with them when you're interacting with them. So, the point I was making overall is that there's a certain degree of respectability in a human being which is not contingent upon any of those things. That was the basic idea I wanted to convey. In other words, that it's, whether it's race or it's gender or it's ideology or it's social standing, typically in society, people are shown respect due to a socially agreed upon or a personally preferred set of qualities. And if you have these qualities, I respect you. And if you don't have these qualities, I don't. This is a very prevalent attitude. And, what I'm trying to bring out from these teachings is that it's okay to have that lens and to show regard for qualities in people, but there should be a fundamental degree of respect that's always maintained for a human being, regardless of what your preferred stack of qualities is. In other words, this is a spiritual, philosophical perspective that can preempt the concepts of sexism, racism, classism, casteism, and so on. That there's an inherent dignity to every individual, and not just human dignity in the political sense, but based on the all-pervading presence of Bhagavan, or based on a fundamental spiritual orientation towards existence itself. And that there's, in this way, an inherent, built into that view is an inherent respectability for every single feature of the entire animation. So that would also, to me, there's also an inbuilt environmental ethic in that concept that, as human beings are to be respected, so also are all other life forms. So to, claim to be a bhakta, to claim to have awareness and devotion and the desire to please Bhagavan, but to ignore the presence of Bhagavan in all the entities around us and to not show due respect to that by treating others according to, a way that's of, fundamental regard for the well-being of the other within the scope that is manageable. That to me is an inherent contradiction and is an area where I believe the Gaudiya Vaishnava culture, the broader Vaishnava culture, the whole theistic culture of the world has a lot of room to grow, to put it politely, to really live out the ideals that they speak of in their texts in a tangibly practical way that translates into the literal impact that they have on their social and physical environment. I feel like we definitely have a lot of room to grow in that respect. And that there can be a tendency in our interest towards our transcendental aspirations to kind of justify irreverence and disregard for the environment or people or so many things around us because we're doing this very important spiritual stuff. And that's a delicate balance. In other words, I'm not here to say that there isn't a place for deeply aspiring for completely transcendental otherworldly things. That's essentially what Raganuga Bhakti is all about.
Yes, exactly.
But nevertheless, I believe that to sincerely follow that path, there is an ethical, practical balance that should be fostered and some fundamental regard that should be sustained in the lifestyle choices that we make, to not live in a state of just internal self-denial and a lack of realization of the very ideals that we cherish.
Yeah, because what I find and some peaks of extremes of Vaishnavism, modern Vaishnavism, is that this isolation from the social awareness as organic whole. And maybe it's coming from the teachings of Bhagavad-gita, you're not this body, that part, and, final instruction of Krishna, sarva dharma parityaja, just reject all the dharmas, and these dharmas mean varnasham dharma, including Brāhmaṇas, and surrender to me. So at the same time, same book, you have so much prizes over Brāhmaṇas, and so I find it like dual catch, double catch. One is that complete isolation and inner surge, inner focus, like in the case of Bhakti specifically. At the same time, the life of external life of a Vaishnava is a harmonious element of the society that he's living in, and respect the society as it is based on Shastra. But I don't find it very prominent. I find it conflicting actually. How the understandings are mismatched sometimes. I mean, you spoke about it just before, so I'm just trying to highlight that.
Sure. Yeah, it seems, it takes a lot of time and practice and education, but, people can go, okay, sarva dharman prityaja, we're just going to do Krishna bhakti. Okay,
Right,
but then what is that very Krishna that you're saying you're so devoted to? What does he actually teach? Sarva bhuteshu manmati, brahmanyata. These are all things that same Bhagavan taught you. So once you, so to speak, completely go off in your transcendental direction, you're going to ultimately still have to practice ideals that make you very practically adjusted to respecting your immediate environment and circumstances. There is, a catch, if you will. There is an ultimate, context in which you will have to live out these ideals to genuinely pursue an experience of transcendence. And that takes a lot of time and education and adjustment to step into, and then to, it's ultimately an art, if you will. So we can be also patient and understanding that maybe not everyone has come all the way along with that, and might be in an initial stage of that where they're kind of maybe a little bit out of tune with society in the name of trying to learn these spiritual things. We can, give people some time, give them a chance, let them come along, But that's why we have these kind of talks, and that's why we also bring out these kind of aspects of the Bhagavatam, so that we can get a wholly, fully integrated way of following the path.
Yeah. There's been, I think the whole concept of Krishna consciousness is to see things organically, holistically. It's one, as you mentioned, it's one environment that we live in, and our own perception, our own sadhana, it's not isolated from the social context. I think we're part of, just like, why would Krishna highlight Brāhmaṇas so much, like what about being born? What's special being born? Well, there is reason why, because there's a genetic imprint in the body, or that Jiva accepts in the line of Gotra, or specific line where cultivation of certain samskaras are being perpetuated generation after generation after generation, and children born within these lines that they have special conducive samskaras, and this is all about samskaras, is it not? Even our sadhana is to create good samskaras, bhakti samskaras, and all other samskaras that will help us to advance. So we should have that respect towards those born in higher statuses spiritually, I would say.
Yeah, absolutely. Birth is not an accident in our view,
Oh, exactly,
right? It's
exactly.
coming from the past sanskars, the past activities of people, so it's considered meritorious to be born into a situation where they have such opportunities to culture such fine things. So what's the pain in respecting that? That's a beautiful thing.
Right. And especially those born in Mahaprabhupada, the line of descendants, like in Canada.
Exactly.
Especially
What a great
those,
place
like,
to be born.
exactly. I mean, it's like respect and honor should be given there. Come on.
Yeah, that someone, merited being born there, that's respectable. And if on top of that they preserve the culture and, perpetuate the tradition, that's very respectable. What a great thing.
Yeah.
All right. Lovely. Well, I think we can sign off from here. And in our next discussion, we'll dive into this concept of dvijata, or twice-borndom, and ultimately thrice-borndom. And we'll look at many of the technicalities regarding how it is that someone is born, twice born, thrice born, and how this is applicable to whom. So these are important features of this whole notion of varna, and they relate to how Vaishnavas are going to treat such persons. So that's what we'll dive into next time. Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namah. Jai Shri Guru, Jai Shri Gaur, Jai Jai Radhe Shyam.
Jai Radhe Shyam. Thank you.